Whether you are recording your gameplay to post on YouTube or you just want to kind of like review your stuff later on, then you've probably heard some of this terminology, which is CRF, CBR, 100,000 kilobits per second, HEVC, H.264, and so on and so forth. The question is, what does it all actually mean? I'm the Retro-ish Gamer. I want to thank you for checking out this video, and we're going to go through some stuff here so that way you can make an informed decision on which way you want to set up your gameplay recording. This is not a copy my settings type of video. This is more of a deep dive into understanding what all this stuff means. So sit down, buckle up, let's get into it. So roughly about 2 months ago, I posted a video which had about an 80% viewership. Here's the graphic that's going to pop up, right? But I had about 80% of people that were watching were actually watching on a TV. Now, when I think TV, I have a 70-inch personally in my living room just because I'm kind of far away, right? My living room's like pretty big, but like I don't think that it's unreasonable to think that anywhere between like a 50 to 80-inch TV is what somebody is watching you on when you get into your analytics and you're looking at, oh my God, you know, 4 out of 5 people have been watching my stuff on a TV, which prompted me to think, like, what does my stuff actually look like on the TV? So I went and checked it out. Prior to this, I've been watching on my phone and on my tablet, and I gotta tell you, I was a little bit disappointed because up until this point, I've been taking advice from a nameless website that chats with you and gives you advice at times, but which kind of screwed me over a couple of times, but that's neither here nor there. This, you know, bing, light bulb flashed above my head, and I decided that I need to start doing research for myself. And for about the past month and a half, that's exactly what I've been doing. So let's start breaking these down with the main encoders that you'll be using. When you first open up OBS, you'll go into your settings. And what you want to do is you'll want to scroll down to your output. Once you are in output, you'll want to go into recording. We'll get to all the stuff here, believe me. Right now, we're going to be focused on encoders. So now when you drop into your video encoder, you'll see that there are basically, I'm going to call it as 6 types, okay? Because all we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the hardware encoders, and each one of these does something different. You'll have a VTH264 encoder, an HEVC hardware encoder, and you'll have a VT ProRes hardware encoder. The 2 main types of encoders that you'll be looking at is the H.264 and HEVC, and I'd like for you to think of these as a suitcase. Like a carry-on, like you're going on a trip, you pack a carry-on, and with H.264, basically you packed it really quick and it's going to be easy to unpack. But let's say with an HEVC, then what you've done is you've maybe forgotten a pair of jeans and some shoes and some things like that. So you've repacked the suitcase and you've just made it a little bit more efficient. Long story short, you have created more data in the same space, which is where HEVC encoder shines, up to a point. ProRes does a little bit better than HEVC, but once again, we'll get into that. Let's get into the common terminology for your encoder settings. Let's start with the one that I think most people talk about, which is CBR, or otherwise this stands for constant bit rate. And here's the way that I'll explain this, okay? Have you ever spoken to somebody or have a friend that talks about 2 completely different topics in the same type of urgency, right? Like, I went to the store and bought eggs. My car exploded, right? This is what CBR is actually doing, okay? It is literally delivering the same intensity of how many kilobits per second you are using on your bit rate. It is constantly pushing that out. So whether you're in a high action epic, you know, boss fight, or you're looking at a menu, it is still pushing that same amount of data in there, which will ultimately result in larger file sizes because you don't necessarily need, let's say, 100,000 kilobits per second going into a menu when you're organizing items. You may need it when you have that epic boss fight, right? You may need a little bit more when you're having that epic boss fight. And this is where CBR is, or the constant bitrate, this is where it's a little bit problematic. You'll end up with larger file sizes for information that you don't actually need. And also, this can cause stutters in your gameplay because you may need more information being given during the time when you have these epic boss fights. So you may notice that stutter, like your character going like like kind of like, you know, it'll be jumpy instead of this kind of like smooth, kind of like wash through, right? So that's what CBR is. It's basically pushing the same amount of information at all times. The second one that we're going to look at is CRF, otherwise known as constant rate factor. And this one is very convenient because it takes the amount of, you know, those kilobits per second that we were just talking about. It takes the amount that you need and pushes it specifically into those situations. Whereas, let's say that if you are in that epic boss fight, you'll be getting 100,000 kilobits per second. But when you open up the menu, it will drop down to, like, let's say 20,000 kilobits per second. Here's the issue with that. The issue is that if you're playing a game that's dark and moody, like let's say Resident Evil, if you stop in a dark spot and you're not moving, then what ends up happening is the blacks start to kind of like melt together and they become blotchy and pixelated. Even though CRF delivers near lossless 4K quality, now when you have those static moments, you will notice a drop in picture quality. CRF ends up being ultimately the smallest file size of the three that we're going to talk about today. However, there's a trade-off to this because you can basically look at it as a zip file. Okay, so when you start pushing this into your editing software, I myself use Final Cut Pro, but whether you use iMovie or Final Cut or DaVinci, it's going to do the same thing. It's a bit counterintuitive because, like, let's say for a 15-minute gaming session, you may end up with like 5 gigs of files that you've used. You would think that once you plug it into Final Cut Pro, it'll go through it quickly. Well, it's just quite the opposite. It actually takes a little bit longer because it needs to unpack all of that zipped up data before you can actually do anything with it. Finally, we get to ProRes. This is the high quality video codec that was designed specifically by Apple to use, in recording, so that way you can edit easily in Final Cut Pro, export to 4K, and just basically it's a 1-1 trade-off, which means that pretty much what you're looking at on your monitor or on your TV as you're recording this, that's the picture that you're gonna get. ProRes, however, is a hog when it comes to file sizes. Okay, your file sizes may end up for a 20 or 30 minute gaming session. You'll probably end up with anywhere between a 40, 50, 60 gigabyte file size. Do keep in mind that the file sizes that I've mentioned here are estimates. They're more or less what you're going to end up with because it ultimately depends on what game you're playing, what kind of situation that you're in, and how much of the video actually needs to be encoded, how much of it is action-packed, how much of it is standing still. And when you take all of those elements and combine them, this is where you'll end up with your file size. All in all, CBR takes up like a medium amount of space. CRF takes up the least amount of space, but it is encoded. Remember that. So when you put it in your editor, it is going to take longer to decode. And ProRes does take up the most space, but your render times will be the quickest. So now comes the big question: is what should I choose? Well, this kind of all depends on what you're doing. So if your audience is mainly tablet and phone concentrated, then I think that CRF is the best format to record in, as this gives you near lossless 4K quality, and those smashing of the blacks, you won't really notice that as much as you would on a larger TV or on a computer monitor. For example, if somebody's watching you online, I would leave CBR, or the constant bitrate, I would leave that alone unless you are doing a live stream. When you're doing a live stream, you're just generally pushing however many kilobits per second that your internet can handle. So if your internet can handle enough to be pushing 12,000 kilobits per second for a live stream, then that's fantastic. Then that's where I would leave the constant bitrate format. However, if you just want to go all in and you can deal with the large file sizes, then my personal recommendation is something that I've started recording in on a consistent basis, and this is what I will be recording in the future, is ProRes. Just because of that fact, like I said, almost 80% of the people that were watching one video were watching on a TV, and looking at some old metrics, there were even more videos and live streams that I had where people were watching on TVs. So I'm becoming more conscious of that. So I would rather deal with the larger file sizes than to have the smaller ones where it won't look all that great on the TVs later on. Okay, now going into the settings, and assuming that you are going to do a CRF setup, we'll basically go into our settings tab, and once again, you will scroll down over here to the output section. Now, once you've hit output, we are going to go into the recording tab, and we're going to take a look at the output mode, which is going to be the first thing we're going to look at. We're going to want to set that to advanced. By default, I do believe that it's set to simple in OBS, but that's basically using OBS's settings. We're going to go to advanced because we want to change our settings. The type will remain at standard, and now we're going to head down here and do some work with our recording path. My recording path I generally like to set on my desktop. It helps me find my files a lot easier. If I need the extra space, I can always move it to an external hard drive, but for me it's going to be my desktop. Okay, now we are going to head into our video encoder, and as mentioned before, I do like to choose the Apple VT HEVC hardware encoder for this specific situation. The next thing that we're going to do after we choose our hardware encoder is our recording format. Now, MKV used to be one of the things that people would choose. What it does is if you have like a power outage or if OBS crashes, you could pick up at the same spot that you left off on. However, for video gameplay, I mean, if I die, then I have to reset to the beginning or to my last save point. So I really don't see a point in recording into MKV. You'd either want to choose this hybrid MP4 or a hybrid MOV or just a QuickTime MOV if you are going to be recording in ProRes later on. But for this specific situation, let's just say we are going to choose the hybrid MP4. Okay, and now that we have our recording format, we have our encoder. Our audio encoder is going to remain the same at Core Audio AAC. We're not going to want to touch that at all. Then the next section that you'll see is going to be the rescale output. Please leave this at disabled. As you can see, there are a lot of functions here, and these are kind of like even more pro functions. You'll just want to leave it as disabled, so that way you keep that 1920 by 1080 kind of like widescreen format as you are recording. Okay, from there, we are going to scroll down and we will have even more encoder settings right over here. With the rate control, you will choose CRF. Then you'll see this slider. Obviously, if you move this slider off to the left, it is the lowest possible quality. If you move it off to the right, it is the highest possible quality. I don't recommend taking that to 100. Honestly, you are fine at 85. I think by default this starts at like 50, but you are going to be just fine at 85. I did one at 20 and it ended up being like a 500 megabyte file, and it was just absolute garbage. So 85 I found keeps you at a reasonable file size, and it keeps you at that near lossless 4K quality that you want to keep. And like honestly, sliding this thing over to 100 creates a little bit of a better picture, but it creates a much larger file size for a negligible result. And now we're going to get into some bottom settings here. Limit your bitrate. We're not going to check that because this is the point of CRF, is it's going to limit the bitrate as it sees fit. Now, these bottom couple of settings are actually my favorite ones. And they're my favorite ones because they're the most nerdy kind of ones, and I personally think the most interesting kind of ones. So we're going to take a look at this keyframe interval, and the keyframe interval we are going to want to keep at 2 seconds. You can move this down to 0. I don't recommend that. It puts more of a strain on your hardware. If you keep it at 2 seconds, that's kind of like primarily where it's at. Now, what is a keyframe interval? Okay, keyframe interval is, imagine that you have like a notebook and you're drawing like an animation, right, of a bomb exploding, right? So you draw the fuse, you draw the bomb, and then you draw like a star just to represent the spark, right? And then each page, it keeps on, the fuse keeps on getting shorter and shorter, shorter until the bomb explodes, right? Then when you flip it, you actually make an animation. This is what the keyframe interval actually does, is it creates a still photo every 2 seconds. So that way, if there is a problem, it can, with the encoding as it's recording, then it can use that keyframe there. Pretty cool. Okay, so with that said, we are going to want to use the B frames, which is the whole point of the keyframe interval, which would be the B frames, just in case anything happens. And the spatial AQ down at the bottom, we are going to want to keep at automatic. Spatial AQ is, again, one of those nerdy things, which is kind of like, okay, so spatial AQ being set to automatic, what that does is it tells OBS to put the most effort and to put the most detail into where the viewer's eyes are going to be, right? So we've already used the epic boss fight, you know, a couple of times here. Let's use it one more time. All right, you're in this epic boss fight. The last thing you need is for a tree that's off into the way corner of your eye to be rendered in the same kind of like format as the boss is, right? The boss definitely needs more detail. And there we are. So after that, you'll basically hit apply and then okay, and we will be done with that section of it. Yeah, and I am like genuinely out of breath talking about all this stuff, but like I said, this is good stuff to know. You know, I mean, the trial and error that I had, I literally sat down for a 12-hour gaming session with the recommendations that I was given, and I recorded a 12-hour gaming session like that just to upload the files into my editing software, and it not being able to read my encoding because said website had told me to set it at 300 kilobits a second if I want to keep it at 4K quality, which is a no. Okay, so let's get into the CBR settings. And the CBR settings, as you can imagine, are pretty much the same as setting up CRF. The only key differences here are going to be, we are going to choose as our rate control CBR. CBR, once again, being constant bitrate, which means that you will need to choose a bitrate. So 100,000 is what I record in if I'm using this, or when I was using this, I should say. You don't need to go all the way up to 100,000. You honestly, as you can see, I'm going to input 80,000 here. You will be fine at 80,000. That is near lossless 4K quality. However, I just found going to 100,000 didn't make that much of a bigger difference in file size. It had a little bit more information, and overall it just worked, you know, plugging it into, or I should say rendering it into my editing software. Everything else remains the same. Other than that, hit apply and okay, and you're good to go. And honestly, that's how easy it is to set up our constant bit rate, which again, I do recommend using your constant bit rate if you're going to be live streaming and you're going to be going, you know, 12, 15, 20,000 kilobits a second. It'll work for you. I just don't see it as a feasible kind of like method to record. If you're If you're conscientious about the 4K quality and the file size, then CRF would be the better alternative. And now let's talk about that monster that is ProRes. And of course, we're going to find ourselves back into the OBS settings section with our output. We are going to keep everything the same once we go to recording here. Advanced, standard, your recording path. This one, you are going to choose QuickTime.mov. And the video encoder, we're going to switch to the Apple VT ProRes hardware encoder. Everything else stays the same as far as your core audio AAC. Your rescale output is going to be disabled. Everything, like I said, and here's the additional encoder settings. This is what makes ProRes beautiful. Do you recall how in CRF and CBR we had extra stuff to do? We had the spatial AQ, we had the rate control over here. None of it matters. And none of that matters because it is a true one-to-one recording. It's basically making a clone of what you are actually playing. So again, if you are space conscientious, then I do recommend CRF for live streams. And if you just want to have something steady to go by, then use CBR. And if you do want that one-to-one aspect, if you do want that one-to-one, I should say, recording kind of like a professional environment, then use ProRes. Once again, I leave that to your discretion. As I mentioned earlier on, this would not be a copy my stuff kind of video. I wanted you to have the information so that way you can make the best possible decision that you can make for your own gameplay. If this video has helped you out, do me a favor, throw a like on it. Subscribe to the channel if you do like gameplay and casual gameplay at that, because my gameplay has sucked since I was 15. So if you just feel like chilling and hanging out and chatting, subscribe to the channel. I look forward to seeing you there, and let me know how everything worked out for you. And by the way, if you do have your own YouTube channel, drop it in the comments so I can come check you out. I hope to see you again in the future. I am the Retro-ish Gamer. Over and out. See ya.